Louis Cavallo, I'm going to come to you because you have to, as Nuha has alluded to, you have to have impact on the ground, don't you? I mean, what you talk about has to be real for people living their lives in hopefully a better, more resilient way. Do you want to talk about some of those things? And I'll come back to the point I made previously, because Amadora is relatively small. It's not a massive city. Has that allowed you to build up sort of community relationships more effectively than if you've been operating in a larger city?
Yeah, I think we have a lot of challenge because, for example, Amadora is the smallest municipality in Lisbon area, but we have the highest population density in the country. So it's very interesting to see that because we have a lot of challenge. We have a area very small with a lot of people living in Amadora. So that's one of the points that have to be more aware of the several points. But we tried just to build resilience. And Amadora, since 2010, we are doing a big effort, for example, with all the stakeholders that we have on the ground. I think the main point is working together with all the stakeholders because we have a strong community. And all the steps that we made since the beginning was just to bring all the stakeholders for the process and show them the benefits. Because one of the things that we have to show for all the community sectors, what is the benefits are on the process. And that's the point that is important just to discuss. Because, for example, all the awareness sessions that we have for schools and institutions, the events for general public, the drills and training, all these kind of events or initiatives should have all the stakeholders together. Otherwise, it's not possible to achieve the community resilience. And when I'm talking about, for example, the stakeholders, we're talking about the local authorities, the fire department, the police, the civil protection, the health authority. We are talking about the NGOs, the schools, all the academia that we have in Amadora, just together and think about this and put the solutions on the ground. The other side is just to try to increase risk awareness, because one of the bigger challenges that we have in Amadora is the risk communication. We have a lot of work done in our municipalities for more than 1 decade. But what is the perception of the community of Amadora about the work that we have done since 2010? That's one point, because I think in some way we have some things that we could just see that are more fragile, but we have a lot of work done about the more sustainable and resilient community. So one of the things that we have to do in the next years is communicate better about the capacity that we have about the prevention and about the rescue, for example. The other thing I think that it's important to highlight in Amadora is the strengthening of social cohesion and working together in an interconnected city, because it's a small municipality and we have a very good collaboration with all the sectors that we have in our city. The other thing I think is the challenge that we have about climate change. It's not clear for us what is the impact of, for example, the extreme events, because Amadora is a small city and sometimes it's not clear if the biggest extreme events are related or not with climate change. So we have a lot of work and a big role just to pause about this. And the other thing that we are, for example, doing a lot is the cooperation with other cities at national and international level. For example, we participate in programs and European projects that have confined us at the European level, and it's important just having this kind of cooperation between cities with the same size, and we cooperate a lot with Italian cities and UK cities, just to have different views about the same problem. And for example, the increasing sharing with cities about data and information and feedback was very important for us. Finally, I want just to highlight three big projects that we have at local level. The first one is the Senior Academy for Seal Protection. We have a specific project for the elderly. They are volunteers and they collaborate with us in the seal protection actions and for awareness sections, for example. So bring the elderly people just to put to the process because they are a vulnerable group in case of disaster. The other project that we have currently is the working that we have with disability persons about disaster risk reduction through the artistic expression, theater, or painting. So we are working with this kind of institutions just to take their view about the climate change, about the environment, about the disaster risk reduction, for example. And finally, where we have the best results in the schools, we have a program. And in the last 10 years, we organized more than 1,000 sessions for the school with all the stakeholders that I mentioned. And I think is one of the biggest, real connection between the school and the community. Because when we have all the kind of issues about, for example, the climate change, about the vulnerability, the risks to the schools have the capacity to lead with this for the parents. So that's a very interesting vehicle that to communicate this kind of information. So I think we have a lot of challenges for the future, but I think when we have to work with the community, it's important to be interconnected and have a good relationship with all the sectors that we have in the community. And that's how we work, and I think it's the key of our success.
Thank you, Louis. I loved it. I mean, this idea of community, stakeholder integration, ownership, empowerment. The UK is usually considered not particularly a religious country. You know, we don't have it deep within our psyche that we are a religious country. I was involved in the London Resilience Gold Command project in 2012, looking at how we could take some of the legacy projects from the 2012 Olympics and maintain them. So we were looking at how we could create a resilient society across London. And what we found was, in London, you cannot be more than 300 meters from a place of worship, a church, a synagogue, a mosque, whatever it might be. You just can't be. You know, it is all around our communities. And of course, what happens is that these give you immediate connection deep into the communities, but also they're actually very connected together. You know, they have joint operations and they have social activities together. And we found that the religious networks and community networks was an incredibly vibrant and powerful part of what makes London London, even though pretty well nobody was aware of it on a formal basis. You know, it didn't appear on the resilience maps, and it was something that came out from there. Nadine, you were working in Indonesia, where, of course, local community informal networks are incredibly rich and actually is the ground on which everything else develops. What lessons did you learn there, and how did you integrate that into your own programs over there?
Again, it's a very interesting question, and I've listened very attentively when Luis and Nuha were talking earlier. And the two things that stand out for me from the discussions, and they sort of echo what my colleagues and I have been talking about here at the University of Gloucestershire, because we're at the moment in the process of working on an impact case study around build. And one of the things that I found is obviously when we're talking about impacts and also the initiatives that our 8 universities collectively are involved in, they are incredibly fragmented. I mean, we have got institutions that we are working with in each region in Indonesia, and there are some communities that may not have access to appropriate waste management solutions. For example, in Jakarta, There are some communities where the biggest challenge is about volcanic preparedness, or earthquake preparedness, some around bushfires. There are some rural communities where coastal communities, not rural communities, where those issues are in the foreground. And then we have also got communities like the one in Palu, for example, where one of our partner universities is located, where a whole community is still recovering from the triple disaster in 2018. And those support needs are very fragmented, and the cultures are very fragmented, as we've already heard. And that makes understanding what impact means incredibly difficult, particularly for a project like this, because there are some quantitative indicators that I can think of that are quite obvious. So, for example, how many volunteers have we trained with our community outreach program or community volunteering program? How many members of staff have been engaged in community outreach activities? How many members of the community have been trained using our virtual reality earthquake preparedness solutions? So these are quite obvious measures. But then actually understanding the effectiveness of those initiatives is incredibly difficult, because in a way, you can only look at risk preparedness as a meaningful measure at this moment in time, because unless a disaster happens and you have got a benchmark to measure preparedness against beforehand, before that intervention, actually, what kind of meaningful measure are you looking at here? So that is quite challenging. So I suppose the fragmentation of communities and support needs, that's quite a challenge. Another thing that is a challenge is capturing lessons learned. Because we do have examples of good practice in different parts of Indonesia, which are worthy of wider dissemination, which work at local level. But then you need to think about how those solutions can be implemented within a different context, because they may not necessarily translate that easily, depending on the economic context, the geographic context, the religious, cultural context. Now, build as a sort of national project, I suppose the methodology of build can be easily adapted, because you're talking, at institutional level, you're talking at policy level, what you could do to gear universities or institutions generally. It could also work with the corporate sector, for example, towards being more aware of their influence in relation to building community resilience, but then actually disseminating examples of good practice within within a particular location or across the globe. I suppose that becomes more difficult. And funding is an obvious challenge here. There is also an obvious challenge in relation to stakeholder integration, and very often there are stakeholders that may be competing, and sometimes that competition may exist at institutional level internally. So you may have, I'm just thinking about universities again as an example, you may have research centers that are competing for funding, for research outputs, for prestige, and bringing those together in a meaningful way may pose a challenge. So, going back to the original question, are we doing better or are we doing worse? I suppose we're doing better in terms of understanding where opportunities lie. I think we do understand examples of good practice, but the actual scaling up, one of the things that Nuha alluded to, I think the scaling up, and Crystal, I think you mentioned the scaling up issue as well. How do we actually do that? That's quite challenging. And I suppose, and again, I'm talking a lot about universities because this is obviously my passion. This is my my expertise. I suppose if you're looking at this in a higher education sector, but also in the corporate sector, if we want organizations with power to make a difference, to actually make a difference, and to think about what they can do to support communities in their locality, we also need to find a way of committing them to doing that. Now, in the higher education sector, the challenge is that institutions are measured based on their teaching excellence, based on their research excellence, and community outreach, and having impact within communities. That's a nice to-do thing. But ultimately this is not reflected in league tables. So I suppose if we want to make a systemic difference, we do need to rethink the system and see where actually community resilience is being brought to the forefront, and actually where institutions that have got power by means of, research capacity, knowledge transfer capacity, educational capacity, economic capacity, that they are not only inspired, but actually also really enabled to support communities, and also they're being held accountable. So it's my little.
Wow, thank you. There's again just so many points. I'm literally filling up all my paper here with notes.